Usually when we look back at military history, we expect to see this kind of, I don't know, clean geometric precision.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like a really clear objective.
Exactly. You deploy the troops, the battlefield is defined on a nice map, and the commander just points and says, there's
Right.
the enemy.
Right. It's binary. You march, you fight, you win or you lose.
Yeah, friend or foe, combat or peace. It's a clean binary, and I think it's deeply comforting for us. We like our history to be categorized neatly, with clear finish lines, obvious good guys and bad guys.
But today, we are pulling from a really massive stack of declassified military logs, operational summaries, and strategic analyses regarding the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka, Opalan.
Right. And the moment you open these folders, that clear map is just completely blurred.
Yeah.
We're looking at an operational landscape that is, well, it's the absolute definition of muddy waters.
It truly is. I mean, what begins as this mission of goodwill morphs, almost imperceptibly at first, into one of the most complex and grueling campaigns the Indian Armed Forces have ever undertaken.
Yeah, it's wild.
It is a masterclass in how a military force is basically forced to adapt when the ground beneath its feet literally shifts from peace to all-out urban warfare.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the API-PON source material. If you've been following along with us, this is the continuation of our series. You can think of this as Module 2 of 4.
And for those of you just joining us, in our first module, we really combed through the strategic background.
We did, yeah. We left off right at that pivotal, almost breathless moment, right? The political decision had just been made in New Delhi, the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed, and the order for military deployment was officially given.
Exactly. The political ink was barely dry on the accord, and the military reality, the massive logistical and operational undertaking was really just beginning.
And that is the exact mission of our deep dive today. We're going to analyze the ground reality for you. We want to understand how a mission that was initially designed for peaceful disarmament just spiraled into one of the most intense, conventional, and counterinsurgency campaigns the Indian Army ever faced.
And as you listen to this analysis today, keep in mind that we are going to look at this through the lens of a rigorous military operational review.
Like an instructor briefing.
Exactly like that. We are focusing strictly on the tactical realities, the strategic shifts, and the core takeaways that defined this conflict. We need to dissect the how and the why of the battlefield, not just the what.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the very first minute. Because I want to know, when those troops first got on the transport planes at the end of July 1987, what did they actually think they were flying into?
That is a great question.
Because the logs definitely suggest they were not expecting a massive firefight.
No, they really weren't. And what's fascinating here is that the primary assumption, the very foundation of their initial deployment, was that this would be an unopposed induction.
Unopposed, just walking right in.
Right. You have to remember the context here. They were going in based on a specific, formal request to implement a peace accord that was signed by heads of state.
Right, so it's official.
Exactly. The troops on those planes genuinely believed they were stepping into a peacekeeping role. It was almost akin to a heavily armed diplomatic escort mission.
But the military always has backup plans, right? I mean, they didn't just assume everyone would hold hands and voluntarily drop their rifles.
Well, they did have contingency plans. And looking at those plans now really reveals just how incredibly volatile the Sri Lankan situation was in 1987.
What were they looking at?
So the planners at Army headquarters in New Delhi, starting around April of that year, they considered three main scenarios. Contingency 1 was operations to reinstate the government of Sri Lanka in the event of a coup.
Wow. Wait, let's pause on that. The Sri Lankan government itself was considered so unstable that the Indian Army might have had to fly in just to prop them up.
Yeah, against their own military or political rivals. That's how fragile the situation in Colombo was.
That is crazy. Okay, what was the second one?
Contingency 2 is even more surprising in hindsight. It was operations against the Sri Lankan security forces with the assistance of the LTTE.
Wait, really? The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam.
Yes.
Helping the LTTE fight the Sri Lankan state apparatus. That is a massive shift from where things actually ended up. I mean, it sounds completely upside down compared to the history we know.
It really highlights the absolute fluidity of the alliances at that exact moment. India was keeping all its options on the table.
Okay, and the third one?
Finally, Contingency 3 was operations against the LTTE to implement the accord with the assistance of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, the SLAF.
Which is much closer to what eventually happened, but still not quite the solo mission the IPKF ended up fighting.
Right.
So with these contingencies floating around in the background, how do they actually organize the command structure to deploy? I mean, we are transitioning now from the political agreement in New Delhi directly to the military staging grounds in southern India.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of how military operations succeed or fail, we really have to look at the command challenges. This is a framework you should remember. The challenges faced by IPKF.
Okay, let's break that down.
In June 1987, the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, the GOC&C of Southern Command, was appointed as the overall force commander, the OFC.
Okay, so Southern Command is running the show from the mainland. That makes geographical sense.
Geographically, yes, it makes sense. But here's the critical operational mistake that emerges from the source material.
Okay.
Because the mission was officially deemed peacekeeping, a major headquarters, specifically HQ-1 Corps, was left behind in India.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Why leave a whole Corps headquarters behind if you're deploying what would eventually become a massive force?
Right. It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah. A Corps HQ provides the brain, the staff, the logistical planning power. Why amputate that before you even deploy?
The declassified logs actually cite three main reasons for this. First, they genuinely believe the task at hand just didn't warrant the heavy footprint of a Corps HQ.
Because it was just supposed to be policing.
Exactly. Just simple policing and disarmament. Second, and this is a really crucial piece of strategic context, they needed to leave HQ-1 Corps in place to maintain the balance of power in the West against Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
You have to remember the time of year. August, September, and October are prime campaigning months in the northern and western plains.
So India is basically constantly looking over its shoulder at its western border while trying to manage this new crisis with its southern neighbor.
Yeah, they can't afford to leave the Western Front unguarded. It's a classic two-front anxiety.
Makes sense. And the third reason?
There was a feeling at the time that if HQ-1 Corps wasn't inducted, the overall force commander's HQ at Southern Command could essentially act as that Corps-size command.
But they were all the way across the water.
Exactly. And in retrospect, leaving HQ-1 Corps behind severely degraded effective command and control when the situation escalated.
I can imagine.
When you don't have a dedicated pre-existing staff structure on the ground, things just get chaotic. The staff element for planning the IPKF operation was essentially cobbled together from 5 different joint forces teams.
Let me guess. Operational planning, intelligence, communications, logistics, and personnel.
You got it. Just thrown together.
It sounds like they were acting as a hospital, sending an ambulance to a massive multi-car pileup, but telling the trauma surgeon to stay on callback at the hospital just in case something else happens. You have this makeshift team trying to manage a huge crisis.
That's a perfect analogy.
In the troops themselves. Who was actually getting on the planes?
So the primary formation selected for the initial induction was the 54 Infantry Division.
Yeah.
The 54 IFDIV was a highly prestigious unit. It was part of the Army's Strategic Reserve. They were exceptionally well-trained in amphibious and air landing operations. They were the right guys for a rapid deployment.
But I hear a but coming.
But, and this is a massive operational caveat, they were inducted without their heavy equipment, no heavy armor, no heavy artillery.
Wait, you send in your strategic reserve, but you strip them of their heavy weapons.
Yeah.
It's like sending a SWAT team into a hostage situation, but telling them to only bring their negotiation manuals. Why strip them down like that?
Mostly because of the political optics. Bringing in collars of T-72 tanks and heavy artillery doesn't look like a peacekeeping mission.
Right, it looks like an invasion force.
Exactly. They wanted a really light, rapid footprint. But the logistics of getting even that light footprint across the Pak Strait were incredibly complex.
How so?
Well, they had to establish an Army maintenance area, an AMA, at Madras.
Madras being the primary staging ground on the Indian coast.
Yes. The commander of the ATNK&K area, which stands for Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala area, was designated as the commander of the AMA.
Okay, so they have a hub.
But security constraints prevented them from pre-positioning massive stocks of supplies. They couldn't just build a mountain of ammunition and rations in Madras for weeks beforehand without tipping their hand to the press, you know?
Right, the international community would have noticed.
So the initial induction and maintenance had to be organized on the fly using Southern Command's existing everyday resources. And again, carefully ensuring they didn't unbalance the border with Pakistan.
So how were they physically moving things from Madras to Sri Lanka? I mean, it's not a huge distance, but moving an army over water is never easy.
Primarily by sea to the KKS, Kankasantharai, and Trincomalee harbors. The Indian Navy controlled all those sea operations.
And the air operation?
Airborne logistics, like the faster-moving personnel and light supplies, went directly to the Palali airfield in Jaffna.
And what about communicating across that water? I imagine 1987 military technology was a bit of a hurdle. We are talking about encrypted satellite smartphones here.
Oh, it was a massive technical undertaking. The policy dictated an integrated tri-service communication system. But standard line-of-sight radios just don't work over the curvature of the Earth across the ocean.
So what do they use?
They relied heavily on troposcatter links.
Troposcatter. I've seen that term in the logs. Explain how that actually works for someone trying to picture this battlefield.
Essentially, troposcatter involves aiming these massive microwave radio beams up into the troposphere, which is the lowest layer of Earth's atmosphere.
Okay, shooting lasers into the sky, basically.
Yeah, and the atmosphere scatters the signal, and a tiny fraction of it bounces back down to a receiving dish over the horizon, in this case, across the ocean in Sri Lanka.
That sounds intense.
It requires massive antennas and incredibly precise alignment. They use these links from Madras to connect to command nodes in Jaffna, Trincomalee, and Vavuniya.
That sounds really fragile. Like, if the weather is bad or the alignment is off by a fraction of a degree, do you just lose command of your whole division?
It can be very fragile. To back it up, they also use high-frequency radio with BEST, that's Burst Air Control System, for their teleprinters.
How does that work?
BEST works by compressing data into tiny, high-speed packets. If there's static or interference, the system just retransmits the broken packet rather than losing the whole message. But even with this, once on the ground, the IPKF essentially had to rehabilitate and utilize whatever civilian communication facilities had survived the civil war on the island.
Just plug it into the local switchboards.
Exactly, relying heavily on standard VHF and UHF for ground-to-air and ship-to-shore comms.
Okay, so let's get down to the actual physical induction.
Yeah.
If you're taking notes for the exam, what are the key timelines we're looking at in these source documents?
The initial induction happened overnight on July 29 to 30, 1987.
Literally overnight.
Yeah. And the mounting bases used for the airlift from India were Dindigul, Begumpet, and Tirupati.
Got it.
On the very first day, July 30th, the Indian Air Force flew 34 standard transport aircraft and 2 massive IL-76 sorties.
That is a lot of planes. What did they drop?
They dropped the 54 Div HQ, 2 brigade headquarters, specifically the 47 and 91 infantry brigades, along with the 8 Mohar Battalion and an engineer company, right onto the tarmac at Palali Airfield.
That is a massive airlift. But what about the rest of the division? You mentioned earlier some of them came by sea.
Right. The 76th Infantry Brigade moved by rail all the way from Pune down to Madras, then crossed by sea, landing at Trincomalee.
And the armor.
The very few armored vehicles they were allowed to bring, which was basically a handful of T-72 tanks and BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, were shipped by sea to the KKS jetty.
Okay, so picture this. We have the 54 Infantry Division landing in Sri Lanka. They are stripped of their heavy guns. Their command structure is fragmented across the ocean. And they are basically expecting to shake hands, smile, and take away some rifles.
That was the hope.
Once the troops land at Pali in Trincomalee, what exactly are they ordered to do? This brings us to the peacekeeping phase.
Their mandate was strictly defined by an order of the day signed by the Chief of Army Staff, the COAS.
And what did it say?
The role was defined as pure policing and maintaining peace. The code of conduct issued to the soldiers was incredibly strict.
Like rules of engagement.
Yeah, but even stricter. Maintain the highest standards of personal discipline, show absolute tact and impartiality in dealing with various armed groups, ensure justice to all, and absolutely no harassment of the local civilian population.
Tact and impartiality. I mean, that sounds beautiful on paper, but incredibly difficult when you're dealing with multiple militant groups who have been violently fighting each other and the state for years.
Extremely difficult.
So what were the specific tactical tasks given to the 54 Infantry Division?
The logs break it down into 4 main tasks. 1, physically separate the warring groups, the Sri Lankan Armed Forces and the LTTE, and ensure the ceasefire holds.
Okay, step 1, separate the fighters.
2, take over weapons from the LTTE and other militant groups.
Disarmament, right.
3, dismantle all Sri Lankan military camps that had been established in the region after May 1987. And 4, help the displaced local population return to their homes.
Let's zero in on task number 2, the disarmament, because that's the big one. How did that actually play out? Because anyone who knows the history of the LTTE knows they weren't going to just hand over their primary source of power quietly.
And this is the core of the early friction. LTTE leader V. Prabhakaran initially refused to surrender a single weapon.
I'm not surprised.
He stated publicly that the LTTE only agreed to the ceasefire on India's insistence, implying they felt coerced.
So they're already dragging their feet.
It wasn't until a massive public rally at Sadumalai in Jaffna on August 4th, 1987, that Prabhakaran finally stepped up to a microphone and announced the LTTE would hand over their weapons, famously stating, quote, "We love India."
August 4th, the Sadumalai rally. Remember that for the exam?
Yeah.
So they agreed, but did they actually surrender the weapons?
Yes, but with a crucial operational distinction that had massive implications later.
What was the distinction?
The surrender ceremony happened in the presence of the GOC-54 INFDIV and the Sri Lankan Defense Secretary. The LTTE surrendered their weapons collectively. It was a highly organized, televised event. Their commanders marched up and handed over piles of arms. However, the other, smaller Tamil militant groups were required to surrender their weapons individually.
Wait, why does it matter? Collective versus individual. A gun handed over is a gun handed over, isn't it?
Militarily and psychologically, it is vastly different. By surrendering collectively, the LTTE retained its organizational cohesion. It was pure political theater. They were showing the population, we are still an army, we are just choosing to put our guns down for now.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the other groups, surrendering individually, were essentially disbanded.
So the LTTE stays intact while their rivals are broken up by the Indians.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the IPKF is carrying out its other tasks. They are actively confining the Sri Lankan forces to their barracks and airlifting them to Colombo.
Why airlift the Sri Lankan army to Colombo? Weren't they needed in the north?
Ironically, the Sri Lankan government desperately needed those troops in the south to fight a completely different Marxist insurgency led by the JVP.
Oh, wow. So the IPKF is essentially acting as a massive security guard for the north of the island, completely freeing up the Sri Lankan army to go fight a totally different war in the south.
That's exactly what was happening.
How is the IPKF interacting with the local Tamil population at this early stage?
Initially, incredibly well. And this is a vital point for understanding the tragedy of what comes later. The IPKF undertook massive civil welfare measures.
What kind of measures?
They cleared booby traps and minefields, often with the very militants who laid them acting as guides. They repaired railway lines that had been blown up. They patched roads and airfields. They reopened banks and provided massive medical assistance using Indian Army doctors.
They were truly acting as peacekeepers and engineers. The local population who had been living in a literal war zone must have been incredibly relieved.
They really were. The locals started returning to their homes. They began to trust the IPKF troops. But beneath the surface of goodwill, there was a massive operational vulnerability for the Indian Army.
What was it?
It was a complete intelligence vacuum.
Let's explore that. You've got a premier army division deployed in a foreign country. What did they actually know about the ground they were standing on?
Shockingly little. The availability of maps was a critical, almost absurd issue.
Maps? You mean they didn't have maps?
Barely. The Sri Lankan forces provided some maps, but the detail was minimal, mostly just old tourist-grade maps or outdated colonial surveys.
You're kidding.
No, it was so bad that the College of Military Engineering, the CME back in Pune, had to step in temporarily.
What did they do?
They had officers hand-drawing and frantically reproducing initial map stocks just so the battalions had something to navigate with until Army HQ could catch up.
You're telling me they deployed a heavily armed division into a complex urban and jungle environment without proper tactical maps of the roads, alleys, and towns they were supposed to be policing?
Yes. Imagine trying to conduct a cordon and search operation when you don't even know if an alleyway leads to a dead end or a main road.
That's terrifying.
And it gets worse regarding human intelligence. Attempts by Indian intelligence to infiltrate the LTTE completely failed.
They couldn't get anyone inside.
No. The IPKF tried to tap into Sri Lankan military intelligence to understand LTTE tactics and mine warfare, but the Indian intelligence agencies themselves were surprisingly unhelpful.
Really? The Indian agencies?
Yeah, the RNAW Research and Analysis Wing, their representative at HQ IPKF, was described in logs as reticent and provided almost zero actionable intelligence to the commanders on the ground.
So the troops are practically blind, they don't know the terrain perfectly, and they don't know what the militants are planning behind closed doors. But wait, couldn't they use the local police network?
If the local police had been deployed and effective, they could have provided that baseline intelligence. But the civil police system in the north had effectively collapsed years prior. There was literally no one to ask.
So what breaks this fragile peace? You have the IPKF building roads, the LTTE handing over some rusty weapons to the cameras, and a blind intelligence network. What is the catalyst for the friction that starts the descent into war?
It starts with intergroup rivalry. Remember, the LTTC wasn't the only militant group.
Right, you mentioned the others surrendering individually.
There were others like EPRLF, PLOT, and TILO, who had recently merged into an alliance called the TriStar Group. Around mid-August, the LTTE began claiming that Indian intelligence was secretly instigating these rival groups to attack LTTE cadres.
So a deep paranoia sets in among the LTTE leadership.
Right. The LTTE felt incredibly vulnerable because they had just surrendered their heavy weapons on television, and then a few LTTE cadres were killed in the town of Mannar.
Who killed them?
The LTTE immediately blamed the rival TriStar groups. And their retribution was terrifying. They didn't just assassinate the leaders, they swiftly and ruthlessly massacred over 100 militants from the other Tamil groups in a coordinated purge.
Over 100 people killed. Just like that. While the IPKF is supposedly maintaining peace and separating factions.
This massacre was the turning point. Because of the massive public outcry over the slaughter, the IPKF's mandate was suddenly and drastically enhanced by New Delhi.
How so?
They were no longer just a buffer force separating the Sri Lankan army and the LTTE. Their mandate now included enforcing law and order.
Oh boy.
This necessitated calling in the Central Reserve Police Force, the CRPF, armed with anti-riot gear. The IPKF was now actively policing a highly volatile, deeply armed, and increasingly paranoid population.
Okay, that brings us right into the phase where things completely unravel, the peace enforcement phase. And for those studying, this is high priority stuff. We need to understand how the relationship between the Indian troops and the LTTE fractured completely, because from what you're saying, the LTTE was never really thrilled about this accord in the first place.
They were highly reluctant collaborators from day one. Prabhakaran had actually threatened to teach the Indian Prime Minister a lesson in a tense phone call right before the accord was signed. Seriously.
Yeah. The LTTE had deep existential apprehensions about the agreement. First, the accord guaranteed the territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. This completely derailed the LTTE's avowed singular goal, a completely separate sovereign state of Tamil Eelam.
So by agreeing to the accord, they felt they were signing away the one thing they'd been fighting and dying for.
Yes. Secondly, they felt displaced as the sole protectors of the Tamil people. The tremendous positive response from the locals to the IPKF's medical and engineering schemes threatened the LTTE's absolute psychological control over the population.
They were losing their grip on the hearts and minds.
Furthermore, they were terrified of the democratic process. The LTTE had a highly authoritarian, militarized command structure. They didn't want to leave their grip on power up to a ballot box.
So if you're Prabhakaran and you see the Indian Army winning the hearts of your people and you fear being voted out of relevance, you have to actively undermine the IPKF. How do they do it? What are the specific tactics here? We need the cause, decision, and impact chain here. Right. They started a sophisticated, multi-pronged campaign. Militarily, they began caching weapons. In September, Indian intelligence noted abnormally heavy sales of grease and heavy-duty polythene in the local markets.
Grease and polythene.
Yeah.
Wait, they're wrapping their weapons in grease to prevent rust, bagging them in plastic and burying them.
Exactly. They were handing in the old rusty rifles to the IPKF for the cameras and burying their best gear.
Unbelievable.
At the same time, intelligence tracked a massive consignment of 700 new rifles, ammunition, and explosives coming from Singapore on an LTTE chartered ship named the Ileana. They unloaded these weapons onto smaller speedboats on the high seas to smuggle them onto the Sri Lankan coast completely under the radar. So they are hiding their old weapons and secretly importing state-of-the-art new ones.
And publicly, because you mentioned they had a lot of influence over the population.
Yeah.
You don't defeat an army just by burying guns.
They utilized a massive, highly sophisticated public relations machine. The LTTE essentially ran a state within a state. They had 3 daily Tamil newspapers printed on their own massive presses right in Jaffna.
Bro.
They had their own radio station. They even had their own TV station beaming propaganda directly into people's living rooms. And beyond the island, they had international press representatives operating out of Colombo, Madras, London, Paris, and Singapore.
That is wild. We think of insurgents in the 80s as guys hiding in the jungle,
Mhm.
but this is an insurgent group with a global PR firm and their own television network.
They used all of this media infrastructure to systematically denigrate the IPKF.
Yeah.
They started organizing massive civilian protests. They would use women and young children to present demands at the gates of IPKF military camps, physically blocking the gates for hours.
Putting the troops in an impossible situation.
And they spread vicious rumors that the IPKF was secretly siding with the Sinhalese government to destroy the Tamils.
So they're baiting the Indian troops. They're trying to provoke an overreaction from an Indian soldier that they can catch on camera.
Exactly.
What were the specific flashpoints that caused the whole thing to blow up into actual combat?
The declassified records highlight three main flashpoints. First, the failure of the Interim Administrative Council, or IAC.
What was the IAC?
This council was supposed to be the political bridge to hold democratic elections. After intense, agonizing negotiations, everyone agreed to a formula where the LTTE would have majority representation on the council.
So they won the negotiation.
The LTTE submitted 3 names for the chairman position. The Sri Lankan president picked one of those names. Prabhakaran agreed, formally signed the paper, and then at midnight, the LTTE completely backed out of the agreement.
Wait, why? If they had the majority and their guy was picked, why walk away from the table?
Because they ultimately feared the elections. Their military wing vehemently disagreed with their own political wing. They calculated that if they forced the IPKF into a grinding quagmire of civil disobedience and low-level violence, the Indian political will would eventually break.
They thought India would just give up and leave.
Yeah, allowing the LTTE to deal with a severely weakened Sri Lankan state later. They believed time was their greatest weapon.
Okay, so the political bridge is burned. What's the second flashpoint?
The fasting of Felpan. He was the LTTE's chief of political propaganda. On September 15th, he began a highly publicized fast unto death at the Nellore temple in Jaffna.
Unto death.
Yes. He issued 5 impossible demands to the Indian government, including the immediate release of all Tamil prisoners held by Sri Lanka and the stoppage of all IPKF rehabilitation work until the IAC was formed entirely on LTTE terms. He refused food and water, and he died on September 26, 1987.
A martyrdom operation. Not with a bomb, but with starvation.
Yeah.
That must have sent absolute shockwaves through the Tamil community.
It was devastating. It created a massive emotional chasm between the Indian forces and the Sri Lankan Tamils, but the absolute tipping point, Flashpoint 3, happens a week later on October 3rd.
What happened?
The Sri Lankan Navy intercepted a boat off the coast carrying 17 LTTE personnel. Among them were high-value targets. The regional military commander of Jaffna, Kumarpa, and the commander of Trincomalee, Pulendran.
Top-tier leadership. What does the Sri Lankan government do with them?
The Sri Lankan government wants to fly them immediately to Colombo for intense interrogation. They claim the men were caught smuggling weapons long after the amnesty period ended.
And the LTT?
The LTTE completely flips out. They demand the prisoners be handed over to the IPKF, citing the ceasefire. The IPKF is stuck right in the middle of a massive diplomatic and military standoff.
That's a nightmare scenario.
On October 5th, the Sri Lankan forces decide to move them. As they are escorting these 17 prisoners onto a military aircraft at Palali Airfield, every single one of the LTTE fighters bites down on a cyanide capsule hidden around their necks.
Oh my God.
All 17 commit suicide right there on the tarmac.
That is just, I mean, you can't prepare for that.
The LTTE reaction to these deaths was swift, and it was completely savage. In immediate blind retaliation, LTTE cadres went into villages and massacred over 200 unarmed Sinhalese civilians, rendering 10,000 people instantly homeless.
Horrific.
They also executed 8 Sinhalese military prisoners they had been holding in captivity, and they threw their bodies out of a van right onto the street outside the Jaffna fort, in full view of the IPKF battalion stationed inside.
It's a blatant, horrific provocation. So what does this all mean for the Indian Army? The peacekeeping phase is officially dead in the water at this point, right?
Completely dead. Which brings us to the pivotal operational decision. On October 6th, the Chief of Army Staff, General K. Sundarji, flew into Palali Airfield to assess the chaos.
And what did he decide?
The very next day, October 7, 1987, HQ IPKF received direct, unambiguous instructions from the COAS. Use the hard option. Use force against the LTTE to disarm them and restore order.
The hard option. October 7th, 1987. That is a date to remember.
Yeah.
That is the day the mission fundamentally changed. But was the IPKF actually ready to fight a war? You said earlier they left their heavy weapons at home and were operating without a core headquarters.
And that is the massive operational impact of this decision, the mission creep. Adopting the hard option at this exact moment was arguably premature.
Why?
The ITKF lacked adequate troop strength for a full-scale offensive. Mobilization hadn't even been officially declared back in India, which meant many battalions on the ground were operating at only 50% strength because soldiers were away on routine annual leave or attending training courses back home.
So they are sending half-empty, lightly armed battalions into a fight against a fully radicalized, heavily armed insurgency that knows every inch of the terrain.
Yes. It locked the IPKF into a long-term insurgency before they were properly resourced for it. But orders were orders. On October 9th and 10th, the IPKF launched what they called demonstration raids on militant camps to show force and try to cow the LTTE.
Did it work?
They captured 131 militants. They also raided Jaffna town specifically to destroy the LTTE printing presses and TV transmitters to shut down their PR machine.
Taking away their megaphone.
Yeah.
And how did the LTTE respond to being raided? Did they back down?
Not even slightly. They responded immediately with coordinated military action. On October 10th, the LTTE attacked a 5 Madras post with heavy mortars. They engaged a 1 Maratha light infantry patrol in a firefight. They ambushed and hijacked a jeep belonging to the Elite 10 paracommandos, killing the occupants.
Wow.
And crucially, they laid a massive ambush for a CRPF convoy, killing 4 Jawlans.
The psychological whiplash for the Indian troops must have been immense. You have to imagine being a 20-year-old soldier. You go from handing out medical supplies and rebuilding schools to being ambushed by the very people you were sent across the ocean to protect, all in a matter of weeks.
The psychological toll was profound. For a conventional soldier to go into battle effectively, you usually need to have a deeply ingrained sense of hostility or extreme hatred for the adversary. But the IPKF troops arrived with a highly sympathetic attitude towards the Tamils. They saw them as an oppressed minority. They were there to help. Shifting that mental gear from benevolent protector to lethal combatant while taking fire from civilian windows in an urban environment, it was an incredible psychological challenge for the leadership and the men.
So the LTTE has drawn first blood, and General Sundarji has authorized the hard option.
Yeah.
But the LTTE's power isn't just in their hidden weapons or their cyanide capsules, it's anchored in their capital.
Yes.
To break the insurgency, they realized they have to break Jaffna.
Yes.
So let's talk about the capture of Jaffna. Very high priority for exam takers. How do you even begin to besiege a fortified city of that size with half-empty battalions?
Jaffna had come to symbolize the LTTE's absolute power and authority. It wasn't just a city, it was their headquarters, their main training ground, and their primary ammunition factory.
It was their fortress.
It had successfully withstood every brutal effort by the Sri Lankan military to capture it. The IPKF commanders decided they had to shatter this symbol to force the LTTE back to the negotiating table.
Let's do a detailed battlefield analysis of this, because this is where the conventional military doctrine really collides with harsh reality. What was the operational plan to take the city?
The 54 Infantry Division was given the sole task of capturing Jaffna, and the timeline imposed on them was staggering. They were ordered by high command to capture the city within 4 days.
4 days to take a heavily fortified, densely populated urban center. Why the insane rush? Why not establish a perimeter, wait for the heavy armor and the rest of the troops to arrive from India, and do it systematically?
That is the crucial strategic question. Why not wait? The answer lies in the extreme vulnerability of their existing assets. They had to protect the Palali airfield at all absolute costs.
Because it was their only lifeline.
Exactly. Palali was their only reliable lifeline back to India, and it was where all their divisional logistics, ammunition, and supplies were stockpiled. If they waited and allowed the LTTE to take the initiative, the LTTE might have mortared or overrun Palali, entirely cutting off the Indian forces.
So it was defensive in a way.
They also had to rapidly advance to shield isolated Sri Lankan army camps that were still dotted around the peninsula from being slaughtered by the LTTE. The strategy was to violently threaten Jaffna to force the LTTE onto the defensive, preventing them from attacking the airfield.
A preemptive strike to protect your own supply line. Okay, so they advance. How many troops did the IPKF have available, and what was the physical plan of attack?
They planned a multi-pronged assault using 3 brigades. The 18, 72, and 91 infantry brigades. The 18 Brigade would push hard from the east while the 72 and 91 pushed down from the north.
Anti-flanking maneuvers.
There was supposed to be a massive seaborne landing by the 91 Brigade to link up with the troops pinned down inside Jaffna Fort, but it had to be aborted at the last minute because the Navy's landing ship tanks, the LSTs, simply weren't available in time.
So you lose your amphibious flanking maneuver.
Right.
What did the infantry brigades walking into? How did the LTTE defend a city they knew intimately?
The LTTE had between 1,500 and 2,500 highly motivated, heavily armed cadres inside the city. And they didn't just throw up barricades. They established a brilliantly designed, deeply entrenched four-tier defense system.
4 tiers.
To visualize it, imagine concentric rings. Tier 1 was the outermost rural line, stretching from Sandypai to Chinnakam to Pooter. Tier 2 was closer in, suburban, Kopai North to Kondaville to Arali. Tier 3 wrapped tight around the city limits, Navatkuli to Kopai South to the coast. And the fourth tier was the dense, chaotic urban center of Jaffna town itself.
It's a classic defense in depth. You fight through one grueling line of resistance, take casualties, and you're immediately facing another even stronger line.
Precisely. And they were fighting a highly sophisticated urban guerrilla war. To understand the operational friction that IPKF faced, we have to look closely at one specific event, the Haley landed operation at Cookville. This is a tragic but vital case study in urban combat operations.
Okay, set the scene for me. What was the objective at Cookville?
The IPKF received confirmed high-grade intelligence that the entire LTTE top brass, including Prabhakaran himself, were holding a meeting in a specific building near Jaffna University.
The ultimate high-value target.
The plan formulated was incredibly audacious. They would heli-drop a company of elite 10 paracommandos in the dead of night to secure a landing zone in the university grounds. Then they would fly in elements of the 13 Sikh light infantry in successive helicopter waves to hold and defend that landing zone.
Okay, establish a beachhead, basically.
This would free up the paracommandos to rapidly raid the LTTE headquarters building before dawn. A massive link-up with ground forces pushing up from the coast would happen within 24 hours to extract them.
It sounds like a Hollywood script. A daring midnight raid behind enemy lines to capture the king on the chessboard. What went wrong?
Almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. It was launched in the early hours of October 12th. Due to limited resources, they only had 4 Mi-8 transport helicopters available.
Only 4.
By the time they landed the 10 paracommandos and the first stick of 30 men from the 13 Sikh LI, the element of surprise was completely lost. The landing zone was under intense, concentrated LTTE small arms and machine gun fire.
They were waiting for them.
3 of the 4 helicopters took heavy battle damage, and the Air Force pilots declared the airspace too hot. They couldn't fly any more extraction or reinforcement sorties.
So the rest of the 13th Sikh Ally Battalion is stuck at the base, and you have a tiny, fragmented force stranded in the middle of a heavily fortified LTTE stronghold with no ride home.
It gets worse. The commandos couldn't convey to the Sikh LI platoon that no more reinforcements were coming because their radio sets had been damaged by enemy fire.
No comms.
The commandos, strictly focused on their primary mission to raid the HQ before the sun came up, moved out from the landing zone, leaving the 30 men of 13 Sikh LI isolated to defend an empty field.
And the commandos, did they reach the headquarters and find Prabhakaran?
No. In the dark, they apprehended a local civilian to act as a guide through the unfamiliar streets. The civilian intentionally misled them, taking them on a dangerous wild goose chase through LTTE territory away from the target.
Unbelievable.
The commandos only survived by using exceptional battlecraft, taking cover during the day, and violently breaking contact at nightfall to escape.
And what happened to those 30 men from the 13 Sikh Light Infantry left behind at the landing zone?
They were completely surrounded by hundreds of LTTE fighters. Throughout October 12th, that single isolated platoon put up one of the most gallant, desperate fights in modern Indian military history.
All alone.
They fought continuously all day against overwhelming odds, taking fire from all sides. When their ammunition finally ran out completely, the 3 remaining men who could still stand undertook a final, desperate bayonet charge against the enemy.
A bayonet charge.
2 were killed instantly. 1 was wounded, knocked unconscious, and captured. He was the sole survivor, later released by the LTTE. The entire platoon of 29 men was essentially wiped out.
That is absolutely heartbreaking, to fight all day knowing no one is coming. When military academies look at this today, what is the core tactical lesson learned from the tragedy at Cookville?
The doctrinal lesson is stark and written in blood. Heli-borne operations in the heart of an enemy stronghold, specifically in a dense built-up urban area, are exceptionally risky and best avoided altogether unless you have overwhelming, continuous suppressive fire from gunships and guaranteed armored ground extraction. You cannot drop light infantry into a hornet's nest without heavy support.
Let's expand on that built-up urban area aspect, because I think people imagine warfare as two armies in a field. Why did a massive professional conventional army struggle so profoundly against this irregular force in Jaffna? You mentioned the LTTE used bunkers.
Yes, the LTTE defense was masterful in its brutality and engineering. Every major crossroad, every choke point in the city was heavily defended. The LTTE fortified ordinary residential houses. They literally built thick, steel-reinforced concrete bunkers inside civilian living rooms and kitchens.
So an Indian army Jawan kicks in a wooden front door expecting an empty house and finds a hardened pillbox staring back at him.
Exactly. These bunkers gave the LTTE perfect observation and overlapping fields of fire down the streets, while remaining completely invisible from the outside until they opened fire. And the IPKF units were largely roadbound.
Because they left the armor at home.
Right, they didn't have the heavy armor to smash through walls, and maneuvering cross-country through densely packed neighborhoods was nearly impossible. This made them sitting ducks for massive, remote-controlled IEDs packed with hundreds of pounds of explosives buried under the tarmac.
And the Indian forces couldn't just call in artillery or airstrikes to flatten the buildings because it was a heavily populated city.
Precisely. The IPKF was fighting with one hand deliberately tied behind its back. They operated under strict, self-imposed rules of engagement that severely restricted the use of heavy weapons to avoid killing the Tamil civilians they were originally sent to protect.
But the LTTE clearly didn't share that concern for the civilians, did they?
Not at all. In fact, they weaponized the civilian population. LTTE cadres would routinely use civilians as human shields.
How exactly?
For example, they would force a group of terrified civilians to walk down a street to present a memorandum to an IPKF patrol. As the civilians disperse, LTTE fighters hidden right behind them would open fire at point-blank range on the exposed soldiers.
That is incredibly cynical. It forces the soldier to hesitate before returning fire.
They also deployed unarmed civilian cadres alongside their fighters. When an LTTE fighter was killed, the unarmed cadre would instantly rush forward and scavenge the weapon. If they couldn't recover the body, they would leave the unarmed corpse there and later claim to the international press that the IPKF was randomly murdering innocent civilians.
It's psychological warfare designed for the evening news as much as physical warfare on the street.
This ruthless manipulation culminated in the hospital incident on October 21st. The IPKF intercepted a radio transmission from a senior LTTE commander named Mahatya. He was explicitly ordering heavy mortars to be moved into the grounds of a 1,000-bed civilian hospital in Jaffna because, in his words, they will be safe there.
Using a hospital as a mortar pit.
The LTTE then actively fired on advancing Indian troops from inside the hospital wards. The IPKF was forced to return fire and storm the building to silence the guns. Naturally, the moment it happened, the LTTE immediately broadcast to the world via their PR networks that India was indiscriminately attacking hospitals.
So if I'm understanding this, the Indian Army isn't just fighting a physical war against concrete bunkers, they are fighting an asymmetric narrative war. But wait, the Indian Army wasn't green. They had decades of brutal counterinsurgency experience in places like Nagaland and Mizoram back home. Why did Sri Lanka feel so alien to them?
That is a brilliant point of comparison. The insurgencies the Indian Army had fought in the Northeast were largely rural, jungle-based conflicts against less technologically advanced groups. Jaffna was an intense urban insurgency.
Urban versus rural.
The IPKF was suddenly fighting a group of highly educated middle-class youth armed with superior modern weaponry, specifically the AK-47 assault rifle, which heavily outclassed the standard, heavier, slower-firing 7.62mm SLR rifles the Indian infantry were carrying at the time.
So despite all this friction, the ambushes, the IEDs, the human shields, they do eventually capture Jaffna. The timeline shows October 11 to late October 1987. Key locations fall. Palali secured, Elephant Pass, Navatkuli, and finally the Jaffna fort. It took significantly longer than the 4 days they planned, and the casualties were severe, but they took the city. Did the LTTE leadership finally surrender?
No. When the military pressure became overwhelming, they simply melted away. Which brings us to the next massive phase of the operation, the insurgency phase.
Right. Another very high priority section for the exam.
Once Jaffna fell and the urban center was occupied by Indian troops, The LTTE escaped the peninsula and relocated their forces south into the vast, dense jungles of the Vanni region. The war abruptly shifted from grueling urban street-to-street combat back to a classic rural insurgency.
So the IPKF wins the city, but the enemy just changes the map. Now they have to chase them into the jungle.
Yeah.
What does the LTTE do now that they've lost their fortified capital and their printing presses? Let's analyze their tactics here, because this really connects to modern concepts of asymmetric and unrestricted warfare.
Impartially analyzing their methods, the LTTE executed textbook asymmetric warfare in the Vanni. They knew they couldn't match the IPKF tank for tank or battalion for battalion in the open jungle, so they didn't try. They reverted to classic guerrilla hit-and-run tactics.
Ambushes.
IPKF convoys trying to supply distant outposts were constantly ambushed. They mastered the use of jungle IEDs, completely denying the roads to the Indian military.
You mentioned earlier they had great PR in the city. Did they have good intelligence in the jungle? How are they finding the IPKF patrols?
They had phenomenal intelligence and communications capabilities. They maintained excellent encrypted radio networks. More dangerously, they actively and constantly monitored IPKF radio nets.
They were listening in.
They could triangulate and pinpoint the exact grid locations of Indian patrols just by listening to their radio chatter, and then lay ambushes right in their path. Sometimes LTTE operators who spoke perfect English or Hindi would even get on the radio frequencies and deliberately transmit false orders to try and mislead the Indian interceptors or call artillery down on empty jungle.
So they are fighting a modern hybrid war. They're using the IPKF's conventional rules of engagement against them.
It is exactly the principle of unrestricted warfare. We saw this clearly during the final clearance of Jaffna. Thousands of terrified refugees clustered at the Nellore temple. The IPKF, strictly obeying humanitarian laws, refused to cut off food supplies or bomb the temple precincts.
Which is the right thing to do.
The LTTE recognized this constraint immediately. They simply hid their weapons, changed into civilian clothes, mingled with the refugees inside the temple, and walked out right under the IPKF's noses to escape to the jungle and fight another day.
Okay, so the LTTE adapts to every move the Indian Army makes. How does the IPKF adapt in return? Because an army can't just keep driving down jungle roads getting blown up by IEDs forever. They have to change their doctrine. What are the counterinsurgency lessons they applied?
This is where we see a massive pivot in Indian strategy, specifically the introduction of massive civil affairs operations. This was something the Indian Army had little practical, large-scale experience with. They appointed a town commandant for Jaffna, Brigadier Kalan. He actually arrived and began setting up his administration before the city had even fully fallen to the combat troops.
What does a town commandant do in a heavily damaged hostile city of over 1 million people?
Literally everything. Because the civil government had fled, the IPKF became the sole functioning administration. The logistics of survival fell to the military. Brigadier Kalan organized local transport to move essential food from the KKS jetty because civilian truck drivers were terrified of LTTE ambushes.
Wow, so the army is running the grocery trucks.
They used army doctors to reopen and staff the hospitals. The army engineers worked around the clock to restore the electrical grid so those hospitals could run life-saving equipment and municipal water could be pumped to the neighborhoods.
They're acting as the mayor, the police, the utility workers, and the doctors, all while still actively fighting a war in the suburbs.
Exactly. They repaired the massive 4,000-line telephone exchange. They reopened the schools and actually provided security so children could conduct their exams. They started the civilian bus services. They even had to tightly manage the distribution of petrol and diesel, implementing a strict rationing and screening system to ensure the fuel didn't end up powering LTTE vehicles or generators.
This sounds like a textbook wham operation, winning hearts and minds.
It was the absolute epitome of wham. But the most critical success factor in this phase, the psychological breakthrough that changed the intelligence picture, was their system for handling prisoners.
How did they handle prisoners differently? Because earlier you said the LTTE was executing captives and throwing them in the street.
The IPKF deliberately moved away from standard military prisons and established rehabilitation centers. They implemented a rigorous, intelligence-driven screening system for anyone detained.
The white, gray, black system.
Right. Black for hardcore confirmed militants, gray for suspected militants or sympathizers, and white for innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. The whites were immediately released back to their families. The others were treated humanely, given vocational training, and crucially allowed regular family visits.
Why is allowing family visits a strategic military move?
Because it completely broke the LTTE's narrative. The LTTE had told the population that the Indians would torture and slaughter anyone they caught. When local Tamil families visited these centers and saw that their sons were well-fed, unharmed, and learning a trade, the propaganda shattered.
That's brilliant.
Families actually started actively encouraging their LTTE relatives hiding in the jungle to surrender to the IPKF. To capitalize on this, the IPKF set up grievance cells where civilians could report issues anonymously. As the locals began trusting the IPKF, they started providing actionable intelligence, telling the soldiers exactly where LTTE weapons caches were hidden and which houses cadres were sleeping in.
So the intelligence vacuum from the beginning of the deployment is finally starting to fill up, not through spies, but through building trust with mothers and fathers. Meanwhile, what is the military doing to physically hunt down the fighters who refuse to surrender in the Veni jungles?
To hunt them in the vast jungle, the IPKF had to massively redeploy and expand its footprint. The force swelled dramatically from that initial single division to 4 full divisions, approximately 80,000 Indian troops on the island.
80,000.
They carved the operational areas into sectors. 54 Division controlled Jaffna, 4 Division was placed in Vavunia, 36 Division took Trincomalee, and 57 Mountain Division secured Batticaloa.
80,000 troops. That is a massive theater of war now.
Mm-hmm.
Give me an idea of the scale of the operations they launched to root out the LTTE from the deep jungle.
They launched a continuous series of massive search and destroy and cordon operations. To give you a sense of the scale, Op Swordfish in February 1988 secured the Batticaloa district. Op Blooming Tulip in March was launched to clear a massive LTTE base complex that the militants confidently called Beirut.
Beirut. The LTTE named their jungle base after a famously war-torn Middle Eastern city.
Yes, because it was heavily fortified and covered over 30 interconnected villages. Then there was Op Trishul in April, securing the vital Elephant Pass. But the largest and most significant was Op Virat, also launched in April 1988, driving deep into the Bani jungles.
What did a massive sweep like Op Virat actually uncover? Did they find the LTTE?
They employed 15,000 troops, armored columns, and paratroopers for Op Virat, and what they uncovered shocked them. They found massive, deeply prepared LTTE defensive lines hidden under the jungle canopy. We are talking about extensive networks of concrete bunkers powered by stolen electric generators, complete with underground hospitals, massive caches of arms, and fully equipped vehicle repair workshops.
They built a state-of-the-art, electrified fortress in the middle of a tropical jungle.
Exactly, and the IPKF systematically dismantled it. But all of this grueling military pressure, the Huam operations, the jungle sweeps, was designed for one singular political goal: to secure the environment enough to hold democratic elections. The culmination of this was Op Checkmate in June 1988, designed specifically to disrupt the LTTE's communication and logistics so they couldn't sabotage the upcoming polls.
So, after all the blood, the ambushes, the infrastructure rebuilding, did the elections actually happen? Did this massive military and civil effort work?
It did, and this is a crucial point of historical success that often gets overlooked. In November 1988, the IPKF successfully secured the environment for the elections of the newly merged Northeastern Province. Despite severe LTTE threats to execute anyone who voted and calls for boycotts, there was a staggering 60% voter turnout. A Tamil chief minister, Varadaraj Perumal, was successfully sworn into office.
So, mission accomplished. The democratic process is restored. The guns are relatively quiet. A Tamil leader is in charge of the province. The Indian army can pack up and go home.
Militarily speaking, yes. Functionally, the IPKF had completed their primary, incredibly difficult mission. They had enforced the accord. But they were ordered by the Indian government in New Delhi to stay put. They were told to remain and assist the provincial government to establish firm roots.
And I imagine staying is where things transition from a military victory into a political quagmire. Looking at the source logs here under external obstacles, it seems the politics back home in India were making the military's job almost impossible on the island.
It's vital we look at these political hurdles objectively, as they directly impacted the operational effectiveness of the troops on the ground. The IPKF found themselves in a bizarre, almost tragic paradox. They were fighting an enemy in Sri Lanka that was receiving substantial backing from within India itself. Specifically, the Tamil Nadu state government was providing significant financial and material aid to the LTTE.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. The Indian army is bleeding and dying fighting the LTTE in the jungles of Sri Lanka, and an Indian state government just across the water is actively funding the people shooting at them.
It is a staggering political contradiction that deeply affected troop morale. For example, the logs detail an incident in January 1988 where Indian customs officials intercepted a truck just outside Madras. The truck was carrying LTTE personnel, illicit weapons, and explosives intended for Sri Lanka. The customs officers were ordered by local political authorities to impound the weapons, but to let the LTTE men go free without arrest.
That is unbelievable. Imagine being a soldier on the ground hearing that.
In another documented instance, the IPKF recovered explosives in Sri Lanka that had been manufactured in Counter, Tamil Nadu, just months prior. The LTTE was operating numerous propaganda radio stations right along the Tamil Nadu coast, broadcasting against the Indian army. And as a final blow to morale, when the IPKF eventually began returning to India after years of combat, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu at the time, M. Karunanidhi, completely boycotted the official welcoming ceremony for the troops.
So the IPKF was fighting against enormous odds, not just in the urban bunkers and the dense jungle, but against the political current of their own country.
Exactly. They're executing a deeply unpopular, immensely complex political decision with remarkable, stoic military discipline.
All right, this has been an incredibly dense, fascinating, and at times heartbreaking journey through this source material. We've traced the timeline from the botched intelligence of the early landings, through the ferocity of the urban combat in Jaffna, the adaptation to jungle counterinsurgency, and the bizarre political paradoxes they faced. Let's lock this knowledge in for the exam. We're going to do a fast-paced 5-minute battlefield recall drill of the critical dominoes that fell during this phase of Ecumon. I'll tee up the operational hurdle, and our expert will give us the definitive historical marker.
I'm ready.
Okay, first hurdle. The logistical anchor. Where did India stage this massive deployment from?
The Army Maintenance Area, or AMA, established at Madras.
Second hurdle. The turning point. When did the mandate permanently shift from peace to war?
October 7, 1987, when the COAS issued instructions to use the hard option.
Third hurdle. The urban tragedy. Where did the isolated platoon of the 13th Sikh Light Infantry make their final stand?
Near Jaffna University, specifically in the area of Coqueville, during the failed October 12th hilly drop.
Fourth hurdle. Winning the population. How did the IPKF break the LTTE's psychological grip on prisoners?
By implementing the 3-tier screening system, white for innocent, gray for suspected, and black for confirmed militants, focusing on rehabilitation over punishment.
Final hurdle. The jungle fortress. What were the massive sweep that uncovered electrified concrete bunkers in the Vani?
Operation Virat, launched in April 1988.
Excellent. If you're mentally mapping this conflict, those are your anchor points. Here are your top 10 keywords from this module. You need to understand the necessity of troposcatter communications for bridging the command gap. You need to know the Army Maintenance Area, or AMA. Remember the hard option. Visualize the LTTE's 4-tier defense inside Jaffna. Know why the heli-landed operation failed. Understand the brutal reality of urban insurgency where human shields were a standard tactic. Know the role of the town commandant Jaffna, the TCJ, and how they executed the WACM winning hearts and minds strategy. And finally, Op Virat.
If you can trace the line between those concepts, you understand the true operational arc of the IPKF's deployment. You see how an army adapts from a peacetime mindset to unrestricted warfare.
So what happens next? After studying how the IPKF fought, bled, and adapted, our next module analyzes the long-term lessons that emerged. We'll look at how different military arms performed, and ultimately why the Sri Lankan military was later able to succeed against the LTTE using some of the groundwork laid here. That will be Module 3, so make sure you come back for that.
But before we close the files for today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We discussed how the IPKF, against all odds, successfully secured the environment and held democratic elections in November 1988. Functionally, they completed their primary, agonizing mission despite immense casualties. Yet, they were ordered to stay.
Right, the shifting political sands we talked about at the very beginning.
Exactly. I want you to think about this. When does a military force's presence in a foreign land transition from being the guarantor of peace to becoming the very friction that prevents it? Think about how the definition of mission accomplished violently changes when political ambition overrides military reality.
It's a haunting question, especially when you think of that lone platoon fighting to the last man in Coqueville, believing they were fighting for a peace that the politicians couldn't define. The neat, clean map is definitely broken on this one. Thanks for diving deep into the history with us. We'll see you for Module 3.